So welcome, Operate First. It's an Operate First community. So this is all about learning and practicing and adapting GitOps best practices and GitOps way in a sort of different way than you would do it usually from learning from books. This is from a live GitOps production environment. So that's something really new. And first, a little bit about me. My name is Marcel Hild. On the internet, I go by the handle do-random. That's short for dev-u-random, the device that's producing unlimited characters or random stuff. I'm a senior manager at the AI Center of Excellence at RedHat at the office of the CTO. It's a little bit like a research department at RedHat. I'm working out of Kiel, Germany. Now it's actually 9 p.m. my time, so it's already dark behind me, but the internet never sleeps. And I'm responsible for RedHat's AI strategy, and not just me alone, but I'm looking after this thing called AI Ops and what we can do with operations, etc. On GitHub, you will find me also under the GitHub, under the account handle of do-random. Let's start with open source. So open source basically has won the way that we develop software, right? So back in the days when you had a mainframe, you would buy the software and hardware from one vendor, and you only got the manuals to help you use this thing, and you had no way to improve this tool. So when in opening computing and the components of the data center, open source returned back to everyone access to the value in creating and running this software. Is it it? And then the open source development model can now rest on its laurels, right? Or can it? I'm not so sure about this, because there has been a shift in the days since open source went from a foothold to really taking over and opening up the data center, starting with the operating system. And it grew out to provide all core data center services. And one of the important powers of open source was that theoretically anyone could get the software and make it run. And they could operationalize and do things with what is otherwise a cold lump, a cold piece of stuff. And while many were writing software, everyone had access to the code to do things with. This leveled the field for using these tools. This leveling meant we could compete or innovate or get lazy, however we wanted, and we would have a fair and equitable chance to make it happen. Writing software, especially from scratch, is hard. Learning operations, one action or SOP, these standard operating procedures at a time, is far more accessible. But as more and more value was found in the operation of code at the dawn of the era of cloud computing, came an increasing ability to capture economic value with workloads data to improve operations. And this provided public cloud operators with a recursive feedback loop that essentially paid them to learn through micro failures. They would provide the compute and infrastructure at a service level that also allowed them to be continuously learning from the telemetry that they were gathering, and to be learning from what had always been an exhaust out to the back of an IT shop because of the scale of logs and data versus the ability of humans to pass them into meaning. So, but what did open source really win? And it turns out open source won is only half right. Open source won as the preeminent software development model, but not as the operations model. When infrastructure is code and operations are not open source, then it cannot create value for the open source that it's being made of. So what the open source movement had done was succeed in evolving the way we develop software as people, but we never really solved the problem of operating that software in a truly compatible way. Making it possible for all open source to come self-operating, whether operating at small scale or operating at web scale. Whether it's go figure it out, slice and dice new configs from old, it's all in the wrist to the complete reinvention of operations as an engineering discipline. It does little good for the improvement of open source software when developers cannot get access to and learn from a live production cloud. That kind of learning has been restricted to employees at large organizations that implement these DevOps and SRE practices. And this restriction of knowledge for the what, how, and why of operationalizing open source software means the developers of the software being operationalized with proprietary ops do not gain from that knowledge. They have no chance to actually watch that code running in production environment. So open source projects have a natural method for incorporating knowledge back into the code base. We call this the classic contributor funnel, where open source projects are purpose-built to allow for a natural progression out of curiosity and interest to turn into contribution. So I want to fix this. Can I contribute? How do I run this? And maybe you make all the path down to actually contributing something back. Versus this software as a service thing, these closed operations of even of open source software, that quickly chokes off that interest toward making a contribution, toward making the software become better. Software as a service will dry out this funnel because you get stuck right at the beginning where you don't have access to the stuff that runs the service. Now that you can see all of the operations to be able to contribute, it opens that wealth of data to developers for improving their software. This means you have read-only access to all the data, and by all data, I mean metrics, logs, support, issues created, just as you would have access to every line of code in an open source project. And open source communities thrive because of easy onboarding, meaning we can turn a small fraction of users into contributors where you read about a problem, or better report a problem, and then if you really want to walk the last mile, you can resolve that problem. So what is Operate First? Operate First is a concept to incorporate operational experience into software development by extending development to include operating, testing, and proving code in a production environment. The first thing to notice here is that nowhere in here it is a requirement on it being open source or open in any way beyond the DevOps teams using these methods. But we know from the parameters here that by the very nature of open source development, if you can provide meaningful data back into the development from a live production environment, it's going to have exponential improvements, not just to that code base, but beyond. Open source developers who gain meaningful data that if they tweak an upstream library they are using, it gets them a 7% improvement in performance. Those developers are going to have an easier time convincing upstream to accept their patches. And that's just the tip of the potential. So let's talk about community building in the Operate First context. We want to be inclusive to all personas. And to be inclusive in this context means to welcome those that want to get started on a journey in a certain area, and be inclusive to those who already mastered a certain area. So somebody who wants to learn how to run a cloud environment and wants to get their hands dirty, and those who already know how to do all this and wants to share their knowledge and want to train people. So really be inclusive on that complete spectrum from beginners to professionals and experts in a certain field. So what personas are we targeting? It starts with operations, with SRE and DevOps people that run, maintain all the components. Then we have developers that create workloads and want to run applications in that cloud, but also those developers that develop certain building blocks of the cloud, like operators and the whole platform. And being inclusive to those who use the cloud. Without any users, you will have a SaaS deployment that is a service that nobody really uses. Only if you use it, you will run into those corner cases. And being inclusive to people that do product support, who help users and connect them to developers and operations people to solve problems and create better documentation. Being inclusive to architects in the sense of building a certain use case and want to run and deploy this use case in the community cloud, open for inspection, open for usage by users, open for inspections by developers, and work together with the ops people to make this deployment stable and a pleasure to use. And then at some point, also inclusive for all the robots and all the small integration tools that help users and ops people alike, and someday feed into AI ops tools, and we'll all have this self-healing and self-driving cloud environment. And you see, with all these personas that we're targeting here, we open up a massive contributor funnel for people to engage with this community cloud and contribute really back to it. So how does this operate first community cloud production environment look like? We started out with one cluster at the Boston University or Mass Open Cloud, and that's in a physical data center. It's comprised of a larger bare metal clusters running in that environment. But we also extended that into a deployment running in Europe. So we already have something that spans multiple geographies, one in the United States and one in EMEA. And we also have clusters running in the actual cloud in AWS. And we're also looking forward to extend that into other bare metal data centers at universities and into other cloud providers such as IBM Cloud. And now with all these different data centers and clusters, you want to run workloads there. And on the forefront, we have the Open Data Hub, which is a project for doing cloud native data science. So you will have things like Jupyter up there, Kubeflow pipelines, and other data science services. This service is available for everybody in the community to use and inspect. And then there's other workloads such as Project Thoth, which provides services for AI DevSecOps and build pipelines. And we have some projects from the Java community, such as AP Curio, Quarkus, and Pulp, and which is a Python index. And we also have a lot of other small deployments. So workloads are running across these multiple data centers on top of Kubernetes clusters. And obviously, you want to manage all that and you want to automate all that stuff. So there's ACM, Advanced Cluster Manager, which is being used for deploying clusters and managing clusters. And we use GitOps for deploying workloads and deploying cluster configurations. For that, we have Argo CD. And then we have Prow, a CI tool from the Kubernetes community. And we have Tecton pipelines for running our build pipelines. And we have the observatory components for doing monitoring, such as Prometheus and Loki for storing logs. So all these tools are there, and they are open for usage by and inspection from the community. And we consider everything as a service. So Open Data Hub and the Tecton pipelines or the monitoring stack, they are not only used to run the cloud, but they are also exposed as a service so that everybody in that community can reuse and build on top of these services. And at the top, there are these operators, which you can run in your cluster, and everybody can use that as a service that an operator provides. And we have relaxed requirements for running these operators. Because in your typical production cloud, you might need to convince the people that run the cloud for getting a community operator installed. But in the Operate First cloud, we really embrace beta and alpha versions of operators or community operators available for trying things out and see how they integrate with all the other components there. So it's really open for a variety of different operators. And obviously, we want to create lots of operational data, because without all the data open for inspection, you would always start from scratch. So whatever we create here is preserved for later inspection and for people to build upon the knowledge that we create and to inspect the data that is being created. and then maybe train some AI ops models on top of that data. Since it's always really, really hard to get a hold of data that is proprietary, we try to be as open as possible and create all the metrics, create all the logs, all the incidents and all the tickets, and give them back to the community so that they can build upon it. The same is true for blueprints. Blueprints are basically architectural decisions that we write down and distill them into documents so that you can follow that train of thought. If you run into a similar problem, or if you're facing a similar decision, such as how do I store my secrets? How do I manage a single sign-on? And these decision records can be used as a basis if you want to create a similar deployment of that Operate First community cloud. So we invite everybody to partake and join the community and help building out this variety of tools and best practices. And now for a little demonstration. I guess I have to exit full screen here. And now my browser is gone. I hope you're still with me. I really lost my browser windows, which had all the tabs laid out perfectly, but it's coming back.
Everybody's still with you? Or
Yeah, I hope so.
your screensaver or your background was good. It was nice.
Yeah, I got lost in space.
Don't we all? Don't we all?
Yeah, I really had all my tabs laid out, so I need to open them here. Anyways, that's the demo board. So if you go to operatefirst.cloud, this is the website, and you are a software developer and you want to deploy your project there on this cloud, right? So it's similar if you would go to a cloud provider and you want to request a virtual machine or a compute instance, or if you are requesting a namespace in a Kubernetes environment. We're all Kubernetes, so you would need to request something on that particular cluster. So you would go to operatefirst.cloud, click on I am a software developer, and then you have loads of documentation here. It tells you what to do, how to get started with Operate First. So you're open source developer interested in bringing your projects. Great. So how do I do this? Oh, I need to request access to clusters. So in order to request access to one of these clusters, I should file a GitHub issue. That's great. So let's go here and file a new issue, which says onboard to cluster. And then you can list out all the stuff here where you want to be onboarded. But that's boring, right? So we want to get people to actually do the deployment themselves. So you can also do a self-provision the stuff. And that's like this learning from a GitOps, from a live environment. How would somebody in the cloud, in the back office, actually deploy and provide you with all these resources that you are just requesting with your credit card? Here's something where you can really learn. And it's all documented. So onboarding to the cluster basically means either creating one of these issues, or you open a pull request. Remember, we're doing GitOps. Everything is declarative. It's all declared in code. So you would open a pull request to the repositories here. And then it has all this documentation, what you need to do. So you will install some stuff on your local machine. You need to customize SOPs, KSOPs, maybe the toolbox. That's still a huge hurdle to overtake, right? If you are already very well versed in these things, maybe it comes naturally to you to install a container on your computer. And maybe you already know what customize is. But chances are that you don't, right? So we want to be, as I said, really inclusive to people that want to get started here. And for this, we came up with a pretty neat solution, which is still not fully fleshed out, but it will be also linked from here. That's basically like an executable documentation. And what you will do is read this documentation, and then you're able to launch into such a Jupyter notebook environment, which is like an interactive IDE, like a development environment. It was usually meant for data scientists, but it's basically something where you have an interactive Python kernel, Python interpreter running, and at the same time you can execute code, and you have the documentation written here. So how to onboard a project to new cluster and operate first? What you read through all these things here, and it basically tells you what to do. So we want to create a namespace in that. Oops. So we want to create a namespace in that cluster. How do I get out here? All the cells are hidden. So it's all live. So, and to be honest, I just did it this morning myself. So bear with me if not everything goes as smooth as expected. So what you would need to do is define some variables here, like what's your GitHub username, what's the project that we want to deploy, the namespace that we want to deploy. And instead of doing that locally on your machine, you can do it all in the browser. That's the funny thing here. So we execute this cell, and we can enable the debugger. And yeah, it executed. Do I see my variables here? Oops. This is going worse than I expected. Sorry. So let's see if this cloning works. Otherwise, I'll fast forward and don't do a live demo. No, it has problems. Sorry. Probably the other browser window was working way better. So anyways, this thing here has all the tools installed that were mentioned previously on the documentation. And it should be as easy as clicking, reading through the documentation and just executing these cells and see what happens as the output. Obviously, this is throwing errors now here, but usually it all just works. So you would fork the GitOps repositories, massage them and do some changes there, and finally be able to create a pull request all via your browser, and then get feedback on that pull request from the Operate First community and all the SREs there helping you to get started. So it really lowers the barrier of getting started if everything was working and I wouldn't lose all my browser windows. Good. So much for the demonstration. Let's go back into present mode. That's something that I can do better, obviously. We're still presenting that screen. Let's hope so.
You sure are.
Good. So onto some metrics. So in terms of contributors, we have around 26 repositories in our organization, and we have 108 external contributors. So this is the blue color of the pie chart, and 26 internal contributors. So you see we have an 80-20 ratio of external folks versus internal folks, which is quite good, right? So we have more people externally working with the community than we have people running the actual community. And obviously everybody can join the community once and work on an extended engagement level there. Then you would be an internal contributor, but somebody who's just creating some support issues there and working there is not really considered a core member of the community. If you look at the ratio of who's creating issues and who's working on these issues, you see that it's the other way around, right? So most people that create the issues and run the cloud, because it's all GitOps driven, that's being done by internal people. And that's something that we certainly need to level out somehow. But in terms of issues being created, and that's opened up tickets, incidents, support cases, etc., we have a nice line of that's growing. This is from starting August 20. When is it starting? August 2020, and by January 21, we broke the 200 issues barrier, which is not so bad for a really young community project that just is about a year old. In terms of issues across these repositories, most of the issues are being created in the apps and the SRE repo, which is just natural because in this repository here, you would create one of the pull requests that you just saw previously, if this would have worked, to create and describe declaratively how the cloud should look like. And the SRE repository is where we handle all our issues and if there are some incidents. We also have that support repository where people are requesting support and requesting ideas and stuff like this. So my call to action to you is that you go to operate-first.cloud. You have access to all areas. You can deploy your demos and you can solve issues. Either if you are an aspiring SRE or if you're an aspiring developer, you can deploy community workloads to this cloud environment in a completely transparent way and see how it's done in the back office. So operate-first.cloud, you're an open source developer, you hit that deploy, not the deploy button, but you hit this call to action button here. If you want to deploy stuff, if you want to help operating things, you go to this I want to learn SRE practices area, and we guide you through how to do troubleshooting, how to help running and maintaining this cloud. There are some getting started issues listed there. As a matter of fact, we right now have Hacktoberfest, and you can sign up for Hacktoberfest and win a nice T-shirt if you solve some of the SRE puzzles that we put up there, and collaborate with us. In the upper hand corner, you have these social icons for our Slack channel, for our GitHub repository, and to access all the clusters. And that's it. I think I'm good on time.
You are. You've got some time to take some questions.
Yes.
So if you are listening and you have questions, you can add them to chat. You can raise your hand. You can, well, I can't see the raise your hand, so don't raise your hand. So you can do the chat or you can do the Q&A. And since we do have a little bit of time, maybe I'll ask you a question that's not necessarily part of your talk, but folks seem to enjoy getting these little nuggets of wisdom from folks. What do you think when you were getting started and learning all of this, and hindsight being what it is, 2020, what would you say the most painful lesson you've learned is that you now share with others?
The most painful lesson. Oh, that's tough. I usually only remember the great lessons that I had. But I mean, I think it's being in a community. You have to be sometimes it can be hard to contribute something and then don't get immediate feedback. But once you get feedback, that's great. So especially in this disconnected environment, and everybody's now working for 2 years from home, and I have associates that never have been to an office, so they really start in a disconnected environment. Yeah. So creating an issue and then not seeing anything happening for 2 days or 3 days, that can be hard at sometimes, but always being consistent and pushing for it, that will give you a reward sometimes. So really be persistent about what you are doing, and ask people and bother people, and yeah, don't give up. Eventually people will come back to you, and they will yeah, take care. And if you contribute to that community, to a community, you will get so much more feedback if you are open. So it's not like showing up and saying, look, here I am, but it's about giving, and then at some point also getting something back in return. That might be a little bit painful. So what I'm saying here, it can be painful, but being persistent pays off at the end, because you will be part of that community. And don't be backed off because you don't get an immediate response or something. It's the internet ticks sometimes faster, sometimes slower.
I think you're right. I think, that in this age of like instant gratification and instant feedback, and, we hold our desktop really in our hands, that oftentimes when patience is involved, or, people have to wait on, we're all human, so people have to wait on us because of our other commitments or whatever, it can feel like it's a personal thing that people aren't answering you back. But I think too, we all learn that it's not personal unless it is, and very rarely is it ever personal.
So being consistent pays off in the end. And even if something takes a year, so I had pull requests and contributions sitting there for a year, and it's always it's my duty, and as the requester, to always revive that conversation and re-ping people and be consistent. I mean, you can learn it from politics. The more people repeat the message, the more it becomes true. And the same applies here. So just repeat your message, be consistent with what you're saying, and never give up.
You know, I also tell people too, like when you have the first person to do something, and then you need that next person to do it, because while the first person is always great with the ideas and all that, it really doesn't catch on. It's kind of like a flash mob. Like you need that second and third person to keep going. And if you don't have that, you know, it's often tricky to do the heavy lift by yourself. So I think your call to action and all the advice that you've given is so great. Let's see if there's any more questions. I don't think there is. Is there anything that maybe you look back at your presentation, and because I know I do this all the time, I give my presentation and then I go, crap, I wish I'd remembered this, or I wish I could have worked this in, or, oh yeah, I meant to tell them this. Is there anything that as you're thinking about your presentation, oh, I'd like to show them this, or I wish I'd said that, or anything like that?
I hope if one thing sticks with people, operate-first.cloud should stick with you. So this is really source code translated to operations. We don't have open operations. We only have open source code. And if you're looking for a cloud-like deployment environment where you can contribute to live operations, this is the thing. So remember that web page.
I think it's great. Like I'm learning so much today just from moderating. So I appreciate you sharing with me, but with you know, with the whole of the community as well. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah. Thanks for bearing with me, and sorry for that live demo. It's it never happened to me. I really literally took my browser, pulled it over to the other screen, and it disappeared. I cannot find it anymore.
But, you know, I think also that shows everybody who's been watching today that, you know, no matter what happens, no matter the, you know, any of the hiccups that happen, you just keep going. You know,
Yeah.
you don't throw your hands up and say, I'm done. You keep going. And I think today has been an exercise, and you just keep going. What is the Finding Nemo, just keep swimming thing, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do. But I'm definitely going to take a look at Operate First on Cloud. So because I'm definitely curious about it and some of the work that I do. So, and again, we want to thank Red Hat for sponsoring the DevOps track today. You know, it's always good to see long time, you know, community influencers, and you work for one of those companies that definitely, I think I've been around that community now for well over 15 years. So just seeing the evolution and the changes that Red Hat has been a catalyst for. So again, the royal we of Red Hat, you know, I think people, myself included, say thank you, not only for sponsoring this talk, but for the work that Red Hat has done to advance open source as well.
Yes, and now re-envisioning open source and apply it to operations itself. So I think that's super, super crucial, because it's a similar time as we had back then with mainframes. It's happening again with the cloud eating up software and making it a proprietary again. So,
you know, it's that circle of change. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same, it seems, you know. So
it's all a little bit of history repeating.
Exactly. Well, with that, I'll say thank you again, and we'll get ready for our next speaker then.
Okay. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye.